these disaster after disaster operations that we've been in for the last 4 years. It doesn't seem like things have slowed down. So it's very hard to try to add something else on top of what everybody's already managing with. And I think there's some policy changes that we can look at, even legal structures and frameworks. As an example, the Stafford Act really sets the foundation for how disasters are managed here in the U.S. Mass migration is not right in there. So there's certain authorities that aren't provided to certain federal agencies and all the way down. So there's really no structure for a response.
Welcome to the Crisis, Conflict, and Emergency Management Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle. And in this episode, we are going to explore a global challenge that transcends mere policy, which is mass migration. We'll delve into how mass migration is shaping emergency management as the next meta crisis. And it's important to differentiate this from what we would call just immigration policy. For example, while immigration policy often deals with the regulated movement of individuals across borders, mass migration refers to the large-scale, often involuntary population movement driven by factors such as war, natural disasters, or economic crisis. These movements create complex challenges, including strains on infrastructure, social tensions, and demands on emergency services, which differ fundamentally from the controlled processes governed by immigration laws. It's important to also understand that many international organizations are now looking at population movement as key criteria for their member states. This includes NATO, which looks at population movement as one of their key factors towards societal resilience. Our guest today, Jorge Rodriguez, serves as the Emergency Management Coordinator for the El Paso City County Office of Emergency Management with extensive hands-on experience in managing crises from related to mass migration, the COVID-19 pandemic, and domestic terrorism. His insights come from a place of deep expertise, and El Paso, Texas stands at the forefront of these issues, rendering this conversation especially relevant and timely. Before we proceed, it is crucial to note that the opinions expressed in this podcast are our own, and we do not represent those of any specific organization or institution. This show has always been and will continue to be about sharing ideas and experiences, allowing all of us to gain perspective and grow professionally. So let's dive right in. And Jorge, thank you for joining us today.
Sure thing. Kyle, thank you. Big fan of the podcast. Thanks for having me today. Looking forward to the conversation.
So this is a wide-ranging topic, and there's a lot to sort of unpack here. But before we do all that, just maybe a bit of background. How did you get started in emergency management?
Sure. Well, I came up through the fire service. I currently served 24 years within the fire service. But the last 7 years, I've been deeply steeped in emergency management. Our emergency management program for the city and the county is embedded within the fire department. So I've served as you said, the emergency management coordinator pool since 2017. I really gained into interest, going back almost a decade ago when all the deep water oil spill that happened along the Gulf of Mexico. I remember just being fascinated. Big admirer of Ted Allen and his leadership in that. Really, that's what drew me to the complexity of types of issues that emergency management, homeland security deal with. So that's really what's drawn me. This is where I want to be, and that's where I am today. So.
Well, that's great. Thanks for that background. And it's really interesting in this particular topic because one of our focuses, and at least a lot of the work that we do, we focus on this nexus between what we call crisis, conflict, and emergency management. And so in this particular lens that I look at this, and it might contrast with yours, and it probably does, and this is where I think it'll be an interesting discussion, we look at population movement as a result of conflict. And so some of the things that we're looking at, and I'll just use this as just sort of setting the scene for the discussion, we look at the war in Ukraine, and then what's happening there. And we look at some of the baselines of like what NATO is expecting, all of the allies to be able to perform. And that includes being able to manage, let's say, 2% of your population to be able to move within your own borders. Now, in smaller countries, that might seem easy enough, but, in a country like the United States with, 330 million people, 2% of the population could be substantial, right? And unfortunately, we've had some experiences which could probably meet somewhere close to that, such as Hurricane Katrina and things like that. But for the most part, what we've also seen in recent years, or since February 2022, is that it's not 2%. It's more like 25, 30, even upwards of 40%, depending on the extent of the disaster, the war, the conflict, whatever the case is, which can cause considerable strain on critical infrastructure, resources, and everything else that goes along with that. As you mentioned, it's like this meta crisis, right? It's beyond anything we've ever planned. All the systems and structures have been sort of pushed to their limits and beyond. This is a really interesting conversation because this is coming from like our perspective and the work that we do internationally, but we also want to take the perspective of, individuals like yourself, professionals in the field that are dealing with this in a context that's similar, but not exactly the same result. So what are some of the challenges you see in terms of emergency management dealing with sort of mass population movement, either into their communities or through their communities or anything like that?
The conflict component of emergency management at the international level, I think, is very much in your vocabulary. But for us here as a domestic emergency manager, we think from a local level, we think about regional, here's our state. We hasn't really entered our risk profile in terms of whether or not this is something that we should be preparing for. And for us, being on the border, as long as we've had mass migration, really that started back in 2019, wasn't really that big of an issue. But in 2019, here in El Paso, we had our first mass migration. This was primarily family units that were coming from Central America. And it was a long, protracted incident. We went around 6 to 7 months, and there were about 120,000 migrants that just passed through our region, what we referred to as the Paso del Norte. And so that was the first indicator for us that this might be something that we might be dealing with as a local emergency management program. Fast forward to 2021, the pandemic, and we see a huge spike of encounters at the border across the entire southwest border. And then in 2022, finally see that inflection point of mass migration again, and becoming a big key issue for us. And we'll take a deeper dive into those specific incidents, but just kind of fitting the context of the conversation today. Yeah, it's something that's not on our radar. We did something to help us in our planning, and here in the state, we put together hazard mitigation plans, and that's where we do a complete risk and vulnerability analysis of all types of hazards and threats that we may face of the community. Well, one of the ones that we added as we were updating our plan was mass migration. And following years is when we actually saw, like I said, that inflection point of the largest humanitarian crisis that hit a border community, probably historic and never seen these levels in the U.S. ever before.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And so in terms of adding into this dynamic into your planning process, I'm curious about that. And so what changed? Because in communities, you're planning for your own population, right? Your community and your citizens, and sort of managing a disaster that occurs there and managing any sort of internal population movement, evacuations, and whatever the case is. Now you're planning for an unexpected factor. You don't know the numbers of people that might be coming through your community. And that's obviously got, in any planning process, you're going to have sort of the significant, infrastructure, economic and facility and resources constraints that go along with that. So how has this impacted your planning process? I mean, there's lots of parallels there between the work that we do and sort of what you're facing. It's quite interesting, but you're having to deal with something that is not very quantifiable. I mean, you could look at statistics and metrics and say, well, over 5 years, it's been this number, and you could try to plan for that. But at the same time, it's very difficult because it fluctuates quite a bit, I would imagine. So what are your thoughts on that? How's your experience been in sort of the impact on your planning process?
Well, planning, I think, has been our saving grace as we've gone through multiple surges here within the community. But at the same time, it's one of the most difficult types of events to plan for because you have so many unknown factors. Throughout this last year, as you may be familiar with, there's a public health policy that's called Title 42 that was put in place at the beginning of the pandemic. Well, as that policy was being implemented, and there were multiple times where that policy was going to come to an end, but it got tied up in courts, and so it went back and forth. So for us, it's always a stop and start or a start and stop operation where it's very hard to build capacity when you don't know if the rugs are going to get pulled out from under your feet. And so for us, we've taken just a long view of it, looking at how we're going to plan for it. And we really fell back to, our existing policies and procedures, setting a long-term incident action plan, setting out objectives for all of the different impact areas, and just working each one and updating that as we went along. So it's helped us organize ourselves, but we've always had to be ready to be able to scale to a number that we just don't know how high we need to scale to. I think that's been our biggest challenge.
At what point do you find the tipping point, though? Because I find it interesting you said don't know the number, which is true. I mean, that's very difficult to predict. And any of the work that we've seen is just a guesstimate at best on what could possibly happen. So have you been able to, in this planning process, identify the tipping point? For example, where like this is the critical point for this critical mass for us. Like after this, something's got to change.
That is one of the biggest challenges that we saw from our first incident in 2019. And just to give a little bit more context to that, we had about 120,000 migrants pass through the community. We had a very large NGO capacity at that point. During that period, they had over 30 what we call hospitality sites set up. And For the most part, there was some government intervention to help support the NGOs, but it wasn't like anything that we've had to do as of last year. So with that context, post-pandemic, as you know, most of the NGO operations run on volunteers. And post-pandemic, that volunteer base was just completely decimated. Of course, retirees, people that have extra time, are the ones that are committing their time to help and their cause. But we had about the reduction from 30 shelters down to about a dozen. And the numbers that we saw last year really just made the numbers from 2019 just completely blew them out of the water. And to kind of illustrate this a little bit more, in 2022 last year, this is about August, right around this time, we began to see a very small trickle of Venezuelan nationals that were coming through the border. And started as a trickle. So here locally, our NGOs have, post-pandemic, have a capacity of about 300 persons that are processed, encountered, and then ultimately released to our NGOs by Customs and Border Protection. That happens every day. That's our steady state, and that's managed. But in that period, we began to see a trickling group of Venezuelans that were committed to the community, and they were unique in that they were first-generation migrants coming into the U.S. Most of our previous migrants that come through our region have sponsors, they have family members that they're able to connect to, they're able to contact them, and they help them with monetary funds to secure their travel and move on to their final destinations all over the U.S. But last year, with a small group, which started out pretty innocently, it was a small group of Venezuelan families that timed out at the other shelters, ended up in our homeless shelters. Well, once we assessed what their situation was, they said, well, we want to go to New York. They had no means to travel. And our system here on the border is not a sheltering operation. It's more of a transportation system, because most of the migrants that come through our region, 99% go on and remain in El Paso. So they all move on all over the country. And so in this case, we helped charter a small bus to New York in that first group. And then from the first day to 3 weeks later, we were went from 300, it went to 1,000 migrants coming into the community at that point. So quickly scaled, our operation scaled, and our system was completely overrun. That's one of the challenges in planning for this, because this was the first time for us, with decades and decades of migration coming through, where we had a population that had no means to move on their own. So the system became locked up. One of our strategies was to create what we call a welcome center. And that essentially helped us develop what came to be the largest chartering operation that the U.S. has probably seen. During a 45-day period that we operated that center, we moved almost 14,000 migrants to Chicago and to New York, which were their destinations of choice. And all of that was just to keep the system moving. And at that point, as you're probably familiar with the chartering that's happening at these large cities, we moved almost 300 charters in that 45-day period and about 14,000. And so that was our first major surge that we had last year. The context is always changing. Another surge in December of that same year. They all came with very unique challenges, and we can kind of dive into those year 8.
To give a little bit of context to the numbers that you're talking about. So again, if I just use my reference, which is sort of a 2% population movement, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the population of El Paso County is around 680,000. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. So City of El Paso, we're right around 700,000, and then as a county, we're at 870,000. Yeah, updated census numbers.
So you're probably looking at, and I'm just sort of guessing here, but that's obviously not going to be 2% if you're managing 120,000 an annual basis, correct? I mean, it's annual basis, right?
Correct. Well, yes. So you need a little bit of the data to kind of bring this out a little bit. So when you look at on that month, our baseline numbers were around 9,226 migrants that were coming through our community. That was based on that steady state, right? About 300 a day, all that added up to that number. In a 3-week time period, that jumped up to 21,000 migrants that were coming through the community. On the front end, on encounters, it went from about 22,000. And by encounters, I mean those are the migrants that were encountered at the border by Customs and Border Protection. That jumped up from 22,000 to 45,000. Over this period, if we look back to March of last year, of May of 2022, which was going to be the first time that Title 42 was going to be repealed. And that's where we saw some smaller surges. Today, we're easily at 200,000 migrants that have moved through the El Paso region since May of last year.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. So that basically, again, just for context, when we're talking about that type of population movement, if we're looking at our sort of, our international perspective here, when our sort of standard metric is 2% internally, you're managing a 20% population movement through 20 to 25%, it sounds like, through your community with an existing population already. And so you're having this flow of a population through your 20% extra people and sort of coming through your community every year, which I imagine puts tremendous strain on infrastructure and other aspects of like that. So how difficult is it to balance the needs of the community versus the need to manage this sort of existential crisis that's happening?
Just to give a little bit more context to our region, El Paso is regionally isolated. We're far west Texas. The next largest jurisdiction is Phoenix. We have Albuquerque to the north, and they're about 4 hours away. In Texas, where all of our resources come, our next level resources come from East Texas, which is easily 8-10 hours away. And so for us, that's just to start, already puts us at a disadvantage just because we're, a smaller jurisdiction. And at the same time, we don't have these larger metro areas that can help absorb some of the flow. And the Customs and Border Protection sector is all of southern New Mexico, and it runs all the way to about Fort Stockton in far west Texas. Very large geographic area, barren. It looks like Mars in some places, So everything funnels back into El Paso because that's where all the resources are, right? That's where all the transportation resources are. That's where a lot of NGOs and all of that. It's the only place that can handle this flow. And so for us, balancing the needs of the community and those of the migrants that are coming through has been a challenge, to be fair, especially with our first surge that we had last year with the Venezuelan population. There was considerable funding that we had to put up front as a community. We were spending just about $10 million. In that 45-day period, we spent about $10 million just to manage that. And fortunately, the federal government, through FEMA, they start providing us funding for these types of operations. And really, that's been the lifeblood for our operations, just because it is so expensive to manage these types of operations, especially when we scale like we did in December. It completely helped us get through all that. And, but yeah, that's something to definitely take into account is we still have services to provide. We still have to provide public safety, environmental services, everything that is a local jurisdiction will require to provide. But this added just a whole other layer of difficulty in balancing both. But we were able to do it.
I also want to highlight, this is not just like an El Paso issue. This is something that, when there was the European migrant crisis a few years ago, I think that was back in 2019 or 2020. But anyway, that 1 million sort of refugees were coming into Europe. It's still happening every day. I mean, crossing boats from North Africa and then landing on the beaches and sort of around Italy and other countries. So that's still happening. And as I mentioned previously, the war in Ukraine and other aspects causing mass migration, or not even mass migration, but sort of, internal displacement of persons due to conflict, as well as, refugees. And so that's something that is just happening all over the world. And so when you're talking about this being a strain on sort of the way you're doing business, and, even within the conditions of being in El Paso, sort of isolated and things like that, how are you viewing this as being sort of the next major crisis, or meta crisis, we might call it, for the emergency management community, especially when we look at and start blending in other things, such as, climate security that's coming up and these other drivers of migration that might be happening as well?
Well, that's something that I've been touching on and have been presenting on this very topic. Really, especially what happened this last year. For me, I think it definitely is a bellwether moment. It's challenged that right now, some of the largest cities in the U.S. are having a very difficult time with. Here in the States, when the largest and third largest city in the country are declared a disaster, as we did, as the state of Illinois did, as the state of Texas did, and the state of New York declared disasters for this, it definitely is a bellwether moment. And as an emergency management community, we operate as local operators, but now we have to open up our perspective to global climate and all the geopolitical shifts. We saw impacts at the beginning of the war with Ukraine, when we saw a lot of migrants moving through California and that point. But then we saw the evacuation of Afghanistan. El Paso well, we have Fort Bliss military base here, which became the recipient of about 10,000 Afghans community. So these things are happening. And now, since the number of migrants that are moving to the U.S. prominently, we've seen about 6 million migrants since about February of 2021 that have moved to or have attempted to come into the United States. And a lot of them are applying for asylum. They all have coming for a variety of reasons, economic, also leaving, like Venezuela, for example, is you're probably familiar with this, that about 25% of their entire population has left Venezuela to neighboring countries. But also we just saw how migration can shift so quickly. Our partners in Denver is directly north of El Paso, about 12 hours away. And they saw the immediate impact. So they were seeing flow coming in, really unexpected, coming into Denver in December of last year. So as emergency managers is really broadening our scope and really taking this into account. Emergency management is going to play a lead role, especially if you have these migrant circles coming into the community. What happened in New York and what happened in Chicago happened within a 2-week, 3 period. So the ability to scale and sustain those operations, especially now as a host city like Chicago, New York, and the demands are just completely different from what we see here at the border. And so that's really what I've been trying to bring this to the forefront of the emergency management discussion, because not only an emergency management issue, but also, there's a lot of homeland security aspects to it as well.
I agree with that. And I think that when I've started to see through having conversations with professionals like yourselves and sort of working, with these subjects on a day-to-day basis, is the fact that we need to evolve in the emergency management space. And I'm just sort of like freely thinking here, so my opinion could change. But I think we need to evolve in the emergency management space to where we start looking at how we go from, and these are just my words, but sort of going from emergency management to crisis management and how that applies to governance, right? And so because these decisions are not something we can control, I mean, they're ultimately at the end of the day, decisions coming out of our national capitals and things like that. But the impacts are felt in our communities, felt locally, and fall upon emergency managers to contain this and eventually grow into an overall crisis that has to be managed before it escalates and gets out of control. And so this is where I do think we need to expand our horizons and our visions about what emergency management is today in 2023, as opposed to sort of the traditional model of just disasters and sort of mitigation and prevention and preparedness. And I would say largely a more response-oriented focus to the day-to-day sort of disaster or an earthquake, as opposed to like these larger crises that could happen because of a changing environment. I'm not really clear on how that could happen. I think there's a lot of ideas out there still floating around. But have you had any ideas about how we can expand our vision and sort of have these conversations?
What's happening with what's transpired over the last 30 months is just so novel. And the United States historically, I mean, we've seen where there's conflict and, somewhere in the world, and we do see large groups moving to the U.S., but nothing to the scale that we've seen. So I think it's just our imagination hasn't really caught up with the reality of what's happening, and compounded by all just these disaster after disaster operations that we've been in for the last 4 years. It doesn't seem like things have slowed down. So it's very hard to try to add something else on top of what everybody's already managing with. And I think there's policy changes that we can look at, even legal structures and frameworks. As an example, the Stafford Act really sets the foundation for how disasters are managed here in the U.S. Mass migration is not right in there. So there's certain authorities that aren't provided to certain federal agencies and all the way down. So there's really no structure for a response to something like this. And the way that it's managed, it's been managed differently at every city that's being impacted by it. So for the most part, along the border community, we have a great network. We're all approaching the issue very, very differently within ourselves. A lot of similarities, a lot of best practices, but I think it's just really building a larger framework on, like you said, I think us getting beyond just the natural disasters and then looking at some of these new meta crises that we have to catch up on and really start looking at very, very close.
I think one issue that we have is that, it's unparalleled in terms of sort of these events happening, but they just keep coming. So you had obviously the pandemic, and then you have a supply chain crisis, and then you get into a mass migration crisis, and then these things just keep coming and coming. And I don't think that that is going to change in the near future. And in fact, what I tend to see more now is that even though there, say on a global scale, there's an initiative to sort of become a bit more isolated on an international sort of scale and try and, get her to a safer space and we're all contained in our environments. I think we are far too interconnected now that we're not going to be touched by global environments and crises. I mean, the pandemic showed that in multiple fronts, and migration crisis in Europe and then throughout the Balkans, and then even in North America is the same issues that we're all dealing with. So I don't think we can escape any of these as isolated incidents, but at the same time, we can learn from what's happening in other countries and sort of see what people are doing because, there's no plagiarism in good ideas, right? I think some of the challenges, though, but made one point, which I wanted to touch on really quick, is that it's just also interesting in the fact that you're having this 20% change in your community population who are uninformed about the risks and the hazards of your community, who are also then possible, who are exposed to sort of the risks in your community. And so now they can become victims if something, say you had an earthquake or whatever, happens. And so your entire planning premises are changing almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's always changing. With COVID, we played a big role of providing isolation and quarantine shelter for a lot of migrants that were moving into the community. That in itself, created such a level of complexity dealing with migration issue, congregated settings, challenges with putting people together, with a communicable disease like COVID really brought down a lot of capacity. And those are some of the things that, we've had challenges with. One challenge for us as a local jurisdiction that preceded the surges that we saw in 2022 was hard. And I like to connect them because I think they are related. After our 2019 surge that we had, about a month later, after the numbers had dissipated, we had a domestic terrorism event where we had an individual that came from the Dallas region, drove to El Paso, and committed a heinous act where we lost 23 of our community members. 7 Mexican nationals were part of that. And we had 25 others that were severely injured. And in the manifesto, the perpetrator, he stated that he was going to put a stop essentially to this Hispanic invasion into our community. El Paso is made up of 85% Hispanics. And a lot of the national media attention that we were receiving during our first surge in 2019, it all played a part in it. But as we jump forward and we look at these incidents of last year, the surges that we saw this year in May, towards the ending of Title 42, there's not only just the homeland security concern for domestic actors, bad actors that have, some animus against what they're seeing, against this type of migration that's coming through the southern border. And there's actors, I just sat through a brief with our federal borders. We're monitoring some of these bad actors that were putting, derogatory information on social media, wanting to commit acts of violence. So not only does it's like a positive feedback loop, right? Where the more mass migration you have, the more people become agitated for what's happening. And some of that can carry over to some type of heinous act that we saw here in 2019. So that has been in our mindset after that shooting, that we were always a potential target for these actors. And as this generated last year through the surges that we saw, our security presence was very much part of our operation, not just to protect our citizens, but also with the large congregate settings that we had for the migrants. So we really worked closely with all of our intelligence agencies here in the region, our fusion centers, our local, state, federal law enforcement agencies to make sure that we had eyes on what's happening. But that potential was always there. And so that, I think, is a completely other element of complexity that's added to mass migration, just because of the political fervor and rhetoric that we see. I think becomes a challenge.
Oh, absolutely. These are things that sort of the network effects or systemic effects of this kind of rapid explosion of population in your community, right? These are things that are just going to happen because that's the effects of it when something like that occurs. And I don't think you can escape those. But I am curious, though, in terms of if those experiences, both with that terrorist incident, but then also in terms of the mass migration issues and the population movement issues, has that changed your approach in terms of talking with the public then?
Well, absolutely. And that, of course, was a big part of our strategies, was providing regular, then being on the border, very difficult to wrap your head around as to why this is happening, why there's hundreds of people outside sleeping on the street, which we saw in December 2022. There's just a lot of complex issues that are difficult for us as the operators to understand, much less our community. So that was a part of our communication efforts, was to try to inform what we were doing, what was happening, and what the future was hopefully going to look like. And we were in the national spotlight during the first surge with the mountain swellens. And then in December of 2022, where the numbers just, again, shot up, we were seeing about 50,000 encounters in that December. That's the highest number we've ever seen here on the border. And we had about 30,000 releases during the month of December. In 1 week, we were seeing about 10,000 migrants being released within the El Paso community. So the whole system was completely overwhelmed. We had hundreds of migrants that had come across what we call unprocessed. They hadn't presented themselves to Customs Border Protection, so they came across illegally, and they sought sanctuary at a local church in downtown El Paso. And these images were projected all over state, local, federal, international media were here. And to have people understand is that, look, these groups of individuals that are unsponsored, as a local community, we can't assist them because all of our federal funding is tied to only working with migrants that had been legally processed and released by Customs and Border Protection. So it's all those nuances that we try to communicate to them, and do what we could as best we can to mitigate the incident and really help those that were on the streets working with our faith-based organizations, our NGOs that did have capacity, and we were able to leverage some of those resources to get some of those folks off the street. So yeah, I mean, that's just, again, the layers of complexity to this issue.
As we do in most of the podcasts, we talk about the local impact, some of these issues, and then we sort of go out and say, what does the future hold for us in terms of these sort of issues? And so we've talked a lot about the local impact in your region and your community in terms of the population movement issue. What are you foreseeing in the future, say in the next 5 or 10 years? And then I'll just caveat that by saying, what should emergency managers be doing today for their own community?
Well, I think as long as geopolitical, your previous podcast, there was a lot of references to climate and those impacts. So I think we are looking at within this next decade where this is going to continue to be a challenge that is going to have local impacts, like especially here along the border. We're always going to be at the front line of this. But any jurisdiction now in the United States can easily become the next New York, the next Chicago. And as you know, Washington, D.C. was also receiving, Denver's been receiving, and then Los Angeles, as of late, has been receiving. So right now, migration, which makes it probably one of the biggest challenges, is that the flow can change from 1 week to the next. And that as migrants come through Mexico, with Texas providing and doing a lot more border security, Texas has become, which was the primary point of entry for most migrants coming into the country. Now it's one of the most difficult. So a lot of those ship migration have moved west, right? Now Arizona is one of the busiest sectors. And so that, I think for us, is being prepared, looking at all of your hazards and threats, but also taking this into consideration because your jurisdiction is going to be having those conversations with your leadership, having conversations with your NGOs, because they play a critical role in managing these types of operations. I think really is just something we, as emergency managers, as crisis leaders, just really need to start having those conversations. Where it goes, I don't know. And I don't know where we're going to be, but the flow continues. And there's, new policies that the federal government's doing to create different pathways and still try to meet the needs of these people that are coming from all over the world due to conflict, due to, a multitude of factors. Their best hope is, continues to be the United States. And for us as a global player, it's just, what's going to be our role in that. And, that comes at a much higher level, right? From the federal government side all the way down to the local. But these are federal challenges, global challenges that really, end up coming all the way back down to.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just to close out on that, I just wanted to highlight, because I just ran the numbers really quick, and it's fascinating to sort of have this international perspective, but then apply it to like your community. And you are dealing with, in your community, you're dealing with like Ukraine war level population movement in your community. I don't think people really understand that or connect the dots between the two. Because if you just run the numbers, you're roughly in the same category. There's 20 to 25% of population movement through your community is on parallel with what's happening in war regions throughout much of the rest of the world. I think people don't necessarily correlate that and understand the impact of that on communities. And so while you're talking about, yes, of course, this is long-term, we don't know what's going to happen, but I think people need to appreciate the impact on our communities by this massive population movement. It doesn't go unnoticed, right? So I think that's something that these conversations are always fascinating for me to try and to connect it to, because we think in one way and then we look at our communities and say, wow, this is really on a scale that I just didn't even think about.
Yeah, and that's something that we try to also communicate as best we can, and the scale and scope of what's happening. It's historic and it's completely unprecedented. The trajectory hasn't changed, and migration has been for decades. It's always there. It's seasonal. Every spring we would see peak in migration because that's the best time to travel, and so we've seen this for decades here along the border. But at this point now, with the numbers that we've seen so consistently, and they haven't abated, this is now the new trajectory of mass migration in the United States.
Something we definitely have to think about, and population movement being one of the next meta crises for the emergency management community. So that's all the time we have for today's episode of the Crisis Conflict Emergency Management Podcast. I want to give a huge thanks to our guest, Jorge Rodriguez, for his time and sharing his valuable insights about the impact of mass migration as an emergency manager and also as emergency management's next meta crisis. It's truly an honor to have you on the show and to hear about your experiences. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on our website or via social media. I'm generally on LinkedIn all the time. And if you like the topics and the discussion, please share and leave a review on your favorite podcast player. Until next time, stay safe. And thanks, Jorge, for joining us today. It was really nice having you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.